So good morning. Um, we're going to take the next hour to talk about some of the crabs of Galveston Bay. Um, uh, so yeah, it would take a week to talk about all the crabs of the Gulf Coast, but it'd probably take longer than an hour to talk about all the crabs of Galveston Bay. So I picked out a few common ones that you might see that might be fun. There's a lot of really cool crab art out there. So I picked out 6 of them that we're going to look at today. Um, it's just some really cool artwork. So what's a crab? Is that a crab? How about that? How about that? And I guess I should have put a picture of Jean up here too, but no, these are crabby, but not crabs. Here we have 3 crabs. These are all crabs, except for this one. We call this one a crab, but it's not really a crab. All right, so let's look at them. To start with the way they are classified, they're animals, of course. They're in the phylum Arthropoda, and that's the largest phylum of all the phyla. These are invertebrates that have exoskeletons, segmented bodies, and paired and jointed appendages. So that's a big group. The largest subphylum of the arthropods after the insects are the crustaceans. They have a chitinous exoskeleton and 2 sets of antennae and highly modified appendages. And then the largest class of the crustaceans are the malacostricans. And these guys have 20 body segments. And most of the familiar crustaceans are going to be in this class. That's the decapods, which are well, I'll get to them in a second. Amphipods, isopods, krill, woodlice, all those different crustaceans. In the decapods, it's decapod, 10 feet. They have 10 appendages, and this is our most familiar, down here anyway, of all the malacostricans: crabs, shrimp, lobsters, crayfish. They're all in that group. Then the decapods are divided into 2 groups based on whether they have branched or unbranched gills. So our crabs are in the unbranched gills group. And then we have 2 infraorders, Brachyura and Anomura. Brachyura are the true crabs. Anomura are the false crabs. True crabs, Brachyura means short tail. Anomura means different tail. And then there's a extinct group of crabs, well, crab-like animals that are called Macura, which are the long-tailed group, that they're not an issue anymore. So let's look at true crabs and false crabs. There are at least 7,000 species in 98 families of true crabs. This is the biggest of the crab groups. 10 highly articulated legs like other decapods. The first 2 are modified into chela. Sometimes we call them claws, but their official name are chela, chelae, chelipeds. They are known for walking and swimming sideways. Some of them can walk forwards and backwards, but all of them will walk and swim sideways. The smallest are the pea crabs, which are 1/4 of an inch. This picture is bigger than they are, and they are mostly commensals or parasites in mussel or oyster shells. We have some pea crabs in Galveston Bay, but you're not likely to see them, so I'm not going to cover them today. The largest of the true crabs are the Japanese spider crabs, and they can be 13 feet. This isn't even the biggest one, but they can be 13 feet from toe tip to toe tip. That's a pretty good sized crab. In Galveston Bay, our true crabs are the blue crabs, fiddler crabs, mud crabs, marsh crabs, and we'll look at each of these. And I don't know if you realize the one that's not in here, that one is a false crab. They are not technically or taxonomically crabs, but we call them crabs. And I'm going to lump them in with the crab group. I just wanted to let you know that they're not really crabs. There's over 2,000 species of them, but they are really a lumped group of very morphologically diverse organisms. They're crustaceans, they're all crustaceans. Some of them are symmetrical, like our true crabs are, but many of them are asymmetrical, which means that they don't have the same the, well, you guys know what symmetrical is. They're not the same on both sides. This includes hermit crabs. Our hermit crabs in Galveston Bay are actually false crabs. Also king crabs, porcelain crabs, squat lobsters, coconut crabs. You may be familiar with some of these. We, every once in a while, will get porcelain crabs in Galveston Bay as visitors, but our main false crabs in Galveston Bay are going to be our hermit crabs. And here's some pictures of them. There's a king crab, porcelain crab. These two are squat lobsters. And here's a coconut crab. And they sure do look like crabs. They look like, especially the king crab, looks just like a spider crab or some other kind of crab that, that you might call a true crab, but they're not. In Galveston Bay, we have 3 species of hermit crabs. So they became crab-like, these false crabs, through a process known as carcinization, which is convergent evolution from a non-crab to a crab-like body. And this is interesting because a scientist by the name of Borradaile, in a publication on carcinization, said it's one of the many attempts of nature to evolve a crab. And I found this on the internet. The crab was inevitable, soon they shall rule the earth, because it seems that a lot of crustaceans want to take on the crab form. I'm using want like they had a decision this, but they're evolving to the crab form because it's so successful. The genetics tells us that this crab form has risen at least 3 times in the crustacea, and all of them are now lumped in the Anomura. And that may be why this is such a diverse group, because they come from different, different areas of crustacea. One of the characteristics of the Anomura that we don't see in the true crabs is that their 5th pair of legs, or pleopods, are flattened and bent and usually hidden, so that when you look at these crabs, they appear to have 8 appendages instead of 10. They're still decapods, but they appear not to be decapods. And here's a couple of pictures of them. This is a hermit crab that's been removed from its shell, and it appears to have 6 legs because these 2 are hidden. They're sort of like anchors in the shell. This is a porcelain crab, and its 5th pair of pleopods are totally hidden, so it looks like it only has 4 pairs of appendages. And that's one of the things that separates the false crabs from the true crabs. So then we have groups that are called crabs that aren't crabs at all, and that includes horseshoe crabs. If you turn them over, they really don't look like crabs underneath. This is an arachnid. They're more closely related to spiders than they are to crabs. Then we have true spiders here. This was a Texas crab spider. This is a spiny-backed orb weaver. It's not even a crab spider, but I can't tell you the number of times people ask me if this is a crab spider. And I think it's because it sort of looks like a blue crab carapace on the back. And then we have crab lice. So these 2 are arachnids, and then this one is an insect. And again, I think these are all called crabs because they sort of look like crabs, but they are not crabs at all. Excuse me. So this is basic crab anatomy. Like other arthropods, they have a head, thorax, and abdomen. But in a crab, the head and the thorax are fused into a cephalothorax, and the abdomen is tucked underneath. And this is in the true crabs. In the false crabs, most of the time, the abdomen is also tucked underneath. In the hermit crabs, it's not. They have 10 appendages, 5 on each side, 5 paired appendages. The first 2 are modified into the pinchers or the chela. They have 2 sets of antennae. One antennae set is, 1 pair is long, the other pair is short. They have compound eyes on stalks. In some of the species, the stalks are very long, and so the eyes are sitting way out here. And others, like in the blue crab and the stone crabs, the stalks are pretty short. So the eyes are almost under the cephalothorax. The cephalothorax is made out of chitin, and it's usually pretty tough. Makes these crabs sort of crunchy on the surface there. Um, and they have mouth parts, mandibles and maxilla, that are all movable. As far as their physiology goes, they are poikilothermic, which means that's, we sort of abbreviate that as cold-blooded. What that means is that they have no control over their body temperature, and they cannot regulate it. So they are sort of at the mercy of whatever the outside temperature is. So crabs in the temperate zone tend to get not totally, they don't actually hibernate, but they go into a slower metabolism in the wintertime. They live in more diverse places than any group of sea animals, which is sort of special for crabs. And I think a lot of it has to do with their anatomy, which might be why carcinization is taking place. They're distributed as species by their tolerance to different salinities and temperatures. So we have some crabs that are restricted to the marine environments, and that would be most of the Gulf crabs, Texas Gulf crabs, most of the crabs that you find in other places of the world. They're found in all oceans. They're found in the deep sea. They're found around the deep sea vents. They're found in coral reefs. They're very important in coral reefs because, well, we'll talk about their feeding in a minute, but their detritivore service to coral reefs helps keep coral reefs clean. They're found in the tropics. They're found in the temperate zone. They're even found under Antarctic ice. So obviously those are adapted to those very cold temperatures. So they're found everywhere. They're very successful. They're also found in freshwater. We don't have too many freshwater crabs in Texas. Most of ours are going to be marine or estuarine, but there are freshwater crabs in the Amazon, and there are freshwater crabs in other rivers and streams around the world. There are terrestrial crabs. They're not truly terrestrial in that they have to be able to keep their gills wet. They're not lung breathers. They still breathe through gills. So they're only going to be found in very humid, sort of wet environments. And they also have to be close to a water source because all of their larvae are aquatic. So they have to be able to migrate to a water source to drop their eggs. And there are some that go through pretty hefty migrations to get to the water. Some of these terrestrial crabs can climb trees as well. They're pretty cool. And then we have our estuarine crabs. Estuarine crabs are actually marine crabs that are adapted to low salinity water. And again, the larvae of all species are aquatic. I apologize. I don't know why I'm losing my voice. It was here earlier. So the way they feed is really fascinating. They search out their food. They have chemoreceptors on those antennae, the long antennae, and they're just basically moving their antennae around all the time, and they're picking up food molecules from the sediment and the water around them. Most of them are omnivorous, which means they'll eat anything. Some of them will eat primarily detritus, and some of them will eat primarily other living organisms. But crabs are pretty opportunistic when it comes to food, and they'll eat just about anything that they can get their chela on. The specific food that they eat is going to depend on the size of the crab and where it lives. And if you take our blue crabs, when they're very small juvenile crabs, they're going to eat mostly algae and bacteria out of the mud. But when they grow up into adult crabs, then they're going to be eating fish and other crabs, and sometimes little blue crabs. They're not very kind when it comes to their own kind. They use their chela. All the crabs use their chela to catch organize or situate their food, and then direct their food into their mouth. And then they use their mouth parts to actually consume the food. So the maxilla is the structures on the top of the mouth, the mandible. These are the two mandibles on this one are pretty large, and they're able to move all of these. And you can see the mouth there. So this is like out of a horror movie, but that's just a close-up of a stone crab. So I have this video, thanks to Chuck for helping us get it in here, which is pretty fascinating. It's a stone crab. This isn't our stone crab, but I think this is a Florida stone crab. And you can see how it's eating this fish. It's using its big chelopads to rip off the tissue. And this particular crab really likes the skin of this fish more than the flesh of the fish, which is very interesting. But and then you can see it pulling on the skin with its mandibles, and you can see the maxilla working there as well. So all these articulated mouth parts make it possible for the crab to eat just about anything it wants to. So I wanted you to see it pulling you could see it pulling the skin up there, and then it just consumes it all. And if this crab is left alone, it could probably consume most of this fish in an hour or so. This is the basic life cycle of true crabs. We start with the adult, and adult females in all species generally mate just once, and then they store the sperm for several spawnings. And depending on the crab, sometimes they spawn over several years, sometimes they only spawn over one season. But the females will, they have internal fertilization, and then the females will basically capture the eggs, and she sticks them together in a sponge, they call it, or berries under her abdomen. So this nice thick abdomen that she has will hold the eggs for as long as it takes for them to develop. These crabs then, depending on the species, will either migrate to the water and deposit the eggs in the water, or in the case of a lot of the crabs that we have, the larvae actually hatch in the brood here, in the brood pouch, and then they are released into the water. When they're released into the water, they're in a zoea stage. The zoea stage is less than a millimeter in size, very, very small. It goes through several molts depending on what the species is, and eventually will become a megalops. A megalops sort of resembles a false crab. Here's the abdomen down here. It's not folded up under, well, same here. It's not folded up under the cephalothorax yet. The megalops goes through not as many molts as the zoea do, and some species there's only one megalop stage, and then it will molt into juvenile. And then the juvenile will go through several molts to become the adult. Molting is very important in crabs because the exoskeleton does not allow them to grow. And in order for the crab to grow, it's got to get out of the old exoskeleton and form a new one. And the only way it can do that is by molting. So here's the different crab groups along the Texas Gulf Coast. We have arrow crabs, box crabs, ghost crabs like you see out on the beaches. They're not on the bay side, they're only on the beach side. Hermit crabs, the pea crabs that are in the mollusks, porcelain, purse, mole crabs, they're also on the beach, spider crabs, and swimming crabs, where we have fewer in Galveston Bay. And I think you'll notice as we go through some of the common ones that the estuarine crabs, the ones in Galveston Bay, aren't nearly as strikingly colorful and pretty as the ones that live in the deeper water. But these are ours, and they're also pretty special. So that's the end of just generalities on general characteristics of crabs. And if there are any questions.
Yes, we've got a couple. Cynthia Hughes has a comment. Cynthia, did you want to unmute and share that with the group?
Hi, good morning, Cindy. Thanks so much.
Hi, Cynthia.
I'm excited about this presentation because I'm going to lead a third grade Girl Scout troop on June 4th on a bay walk. So this is going to come in really handy for me. And I do have another question. I wonder what a fiddler crab is asymmetrical. So I'm wondering how that works as a true crab.
So that's a really good question. They are not asymmetrical. They're considered to be symmetrical. The only thing that's asymmetrical are those chela. And the chela are often asymmetrical in true crabs, but the rest of the body plan is symmetrical.
Okay, thank you. Jean, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I was, I'm sorry, this is not about crabs, but that whole carcinization thing really got my attention. So give me two more examples of species that are carcinizationing, whatever.
As far as I know, it only happens in crustaceans.
Oh, really?
It's
Okay.
making crustaceans into crabs, other crustaceans into crabs.
Okay.
It's making lobsters into crabs or something else, but as far as I know, it's only crustaceans.
So it's not foxes into birds or anything like that.
No, it'd have to be a crab because the carcinization refers to crab.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And they're not parthenogenic.
Oh, I was hoping.
Okay, Verva, you're next.
Cindy, you said that they mate once, but they have they store the sperm and they have successive spawning. So do they create new eggs for each spawning, or
Yes.
do they keep, okay, so they're not like humans where all their eggs are there to start with and they can release a few.
Right.
Cool. Thank you, Cindy.
Okay, and Pam.
So I may be getting ahead of you, but I've seen events where there are huge numbers of crabs that appear like on the road or whatever. And I was wondering what is happening then. I had assumed it was some sort of mating event, but it sounds like maybe not. And do any of our crabs do that?
The only ones that I know of our crabs that congregate like that are the fiddler crabs, and they do some social feeding in different tide conditions. But those are mostly land crabs, I think, that you see walking all over the roads. And I'm not really sure if it's for mating or not, or if they're just migrating. Don't know that for sure.
Okay, and Jennifer.
Yeah, I was just curious if you could talk about the molt a little bit. Do they, because I've never seen this before, like, do they shed their whole exoskeleton at once, or do they do like one part at a time? How does that work?
That's coming up in blue crabs.
Okay, cool.
That's going to be our next thing. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, Cindy, that looks like that's it for now.
Okay, let's head on. All right, so I'm going to talk about six common representatives of six common groups of crabs in Galveston Bay. And the first one, and the one everybody is familiar with and eats and appreciates, are blue crabs. And I love the name blue crab because Calli in the first part of the genus names means beautiful in Greek. Nectes is swimmer. So this is Greek for beautiful swimmer. And then, it was named back in Linnaeus' time. And so the species name is sapidus, which means savory. So they are obviously eating these crabs. We have been eating these crabs for a long time. They are in the swimming crab family, Fortunidae, and swimming crabs have their last pleopod or last leg modified into these sort of flipper-like things, which helps them basically as paddles while they're swimming. These are walking legs, then they have the two chela, and then these swimming, modified swimming legs. So all of the crabs in this family have that. And there are a number of crabs. So the one that we see in Galveston Bay is the blue crab. But if you go out on the Gulf side of Galveston, there's a couple more that you can often see. So there's our blue crab. I've read anecdotally that if they have red tips on their chela, they're females, and if they have blue tips, they're males. But I have never been able to, I've never been able to confirm that because I've seen red tips on both. They are our largest Galveston Bay crab. They can be at least 9 inches from tip to tip on their cephalothorax. The blue color comes from pigments in their carapace, and the older they are, the bluer they are, and if they've got good nutrition. When they're juvenile crabs, they're brown. When I take my classes out to do some studies in Galveston, we're collecting all these juvenile blue crabs, and they're brown. And sometimes my students don't want to believe that they're actually blue crabs, but they are. They're native to the Gulf of Mexico and the U.S. Atlantic coast, but because of their value in as a food source, they've been introduced internationally, and they actually do very well in just about any place they've been introduced. But nobody calls them an invasive species. I guess it's because they're wanted for food. Interestingly enough, this species may be benefited by global climate change. And there's evidence that with sea temperatures warming, they are expanding their range northward. Nobody really knows what this is going to do to the ecology of some of these other places and or where they're moving into, but they do seem to be expanding their range. So again, they're considered to be symmetrical, but they have unequally sized chela. And like many crabs, one of these is modified into a crushing claw, and the other one is a pinching claw. And so they can grab their prey with the pinching claw and then crush it with the stronger claw. We see this dimorphism of their claws even stronger in the stone crabs, which we'll see a little bit later. Their abdomen is sexually dimorphic. This is a male crab. Here's the female. This is a mature female and an immature female. And I've seen that if you want sort of a way to remember it, the males look like the Washington Monument. The female abdomen looks like the US Capitol. So I figured if you can remember these two things, you can probably remember what they look like, but you know, whatever. So this is a sponge crab. This is a female, a mature female that has all the eggs that she's holding. Blue crabs, adult blue crabs will eat mussels, they'll eat snails, they'll eat small fish, plants, and they spend a lot of time eating dead fish and other dead stuff along the coast or in the marsh. The young crabs, the juvenile crabs, will go after smaller food. Small crabs do not have these dimorphic claws. Their claws are the same, and they can only, and they're also very soft. They're very weak, so they have to just pick up little stuff. A lot of detritus. The juveniles are preyed on by many organisms, so we're not the only ones that like crab. Fish like crab. There's all kinds of stuff out there. So they're one of nature's perfect food sources when they're young. This is the blue crab life cycle. So I talked in general about the life cycle of crabs. But we know a lot about the actual life cycle of the blue crab, which is a good example of how it works. So the blue crab life cycle consists of 27 molts. If you get this is average. If you get a really old blue crab, it's going to be more than that. But we could start with an adult female sponge crab. She will hold about 2 million eggs under her abdomen here. And in this one spawning, she'll release the eggs and form the sponge in about 2 hours worth of time. So it's very, very fast. She'll hold these against her cephalothorax, and then the mating occurs in the estuary, and then she'll make her way out to the highest salinity place she can find. And in Galveston Bay, that'll be toward the coast. And when she gets the high salinity, then she'll release her eggs. I'm sorry. Well, she'll release her eggs that are about ready to hatch. They're almost larvae by this time. So then they hatch into zoea. Zoea are about 0.25 millimeters in size. And this is not pointing to the little spine here. It's the entire organism is 0.25 millimeters. Very, very small. You can't see them except with a microscope. They go through 4 to 7 molts. This all depends on the temperature. It depends on how much food they're getting. I guess it's more temperature related than anything else. And it takes up to a couple of months, or a little more than a couple of months. Sometimes human people, swimmers that are out on the beaches in Galveston and Bolivar in the springtime will complain of something attacking them in their swimming suits and causing stinging and itching and all that. That's usually these little blue crab zoea. They get caught in synthetic materials, and then they wiggle around in there. And what people are feeling is this little spine up here is basically poking them. The little tiny thing is poking their skin. So the best thing to do is to take that swimming suit off. And Jean, don't get any ideas here. So in these 4 to 7 molts, they will end up being in the megalops stage. And the megalops stage is less than 2 millimeters, still very tiny, but you can see it looks more like a crab now and less like just some little zooplankton. This actually is part of the zooplankton here. The megalops is also part of the zooplankton. These are swimming near the surface of the Gulf on the outside of the estuary, and they're feeding on phytoplankton and anything that's smaller than they are. The megalops. Whoops! Need to do my animations here. The megalop stage is 1 molt only, and it lasts about 3 weeks, 1 week to 3 weeks. And at this point, then the megalops are starting to migrate into the estuary toward low salinity water. And they really don't know they're coming into the estuary. All they know is that they're heading for lower salinity water. And in this time, they're going to migrate into the bay, and there'll be a juvenile stage crab. These juvenile stage crabs start at about 2.5 millimeters. Whoops. And they will go through up to 10 molts to become a young adult. And then after that, the number of molts is just going to be based on the age of the crab. Again, in order for these adults to grow, they're going to have to molt. And this is how they molt. To answer the question that was asked earlier. So when a crab, this is all controlled by hormones, and when a blue crab is like getting ready to get bigger, it's got growing pains inside, then it will enter what's called a pre-molt period. And during the pre-molt period, this exoskeleton gets sort of soft. It's not a soft shell crab, that's going to come later, but this is becoming softened up a little bit. And then when molting starts, actual molting is called ecdysis. The crab will split, or it'll start taking in a lot of water and swell up, and it will split its carapace right here along the back edge. So it's going to split the cephalothorax from the abdomen. And then this is the new crab, which has a sort of rudimentary carapace. It's underneath the old carapace, and it starts sliding itself out. You see how it's starting to work its way out? Eventually, So eventually here's the new crab, and here's the slough or the carapace of its old carapace. It has to pull its legs out of the old carapace. It has to pull its chela out. It has to pull its eye stalks out. And I'm sorry, these pictures are blurred, but I got them off the internet. It's the best I could get. So you can see you've got, well, you don't see the whole thing here, but what's left then is an empty shell or an empty carapace of a crab. And here's the final. This is a soft shell crab. This is what we call soft shell crabs. These crabs are extremely vulnerable to predation, so they have to go hide. It takes them about 72 hours to harden up. They're still soft and malleable, and when they pull out of the old carapace, this is when they go through the growth. So they can grow about 25% bigger than where they were here. So they come out of the old carapace and they're the same size, and then they grow. In that 72 hours, they grow and harden. What's really cool is, and you can find these in the bay, and this is for Cynthia if her students find these, is you can find these recently sloughed carapaces along the bank. And if you pick them up, it looks like a dead crab, but if you pick it up and you can open it up here and open it up and it's empty inside, then you know it is a carapace that has just been sloughed. And what I've done in the past, what you can do with these things is they're still wet. You can take them out and you can arrange them so it may look like this and let them dry. And you have a nice specimen that's not a dead crab. It never smells. It just dries up very nicely. So that's the process of ecdysis. Most all true crabs go through this. The timing is going to be different. The actual way they do it might vary a little bit, but this is how this is how the blue crab does it. If you buy soft shell crabs to eat, they're in this stage where they have just molted, and they have to be collected and prepared before that 72 hours is up, or they're no longer soft shell crabs. Now, in mating purposes, males will search out a molting female, and they may be able to sense that she's in pre-molt, and the male will, a male will guard a female while she's going through pre-molt and ecdysis. Ecdysis actually occurs pretty quickly. And then he'll guard her, and then he'll mate with her while she's in the soft shell stage. And then he'll guard her until she is, until her carapace is hardened. And then they swim away. And again, the males can mate any number of times, but the females will only mate once. And the female blue crabs will mate in their last adult molting, last adult ecdysis period. Okay, I guess I will go through all of these crabs, and then we'll do questions at the end, because I know there may be some questions about this. Stone crabs. Stone crabs have a very thick, very hard exoskeleton. They're brownish even when they're big. They're stout. They're sort of round or squarish, and they're about as long widthwise as they are lengthwise. They are our heaviest, strongest crab. They have large, unequally sized chelae. They again have a crusher and a pincher. You can see it a little better here. This is the pincher on this side, and this is the crusher. The crusher has more teeth. It's usually a thicker claw, where this one may be a little more elongated. They have black tips. That's how you can know you have a spider crab. They're found all along the U.S. Gulf Coast, all the way down to Tamaulipas, Mexico. And we used to call them Menippe mercenaria back when I was in school. Now it's called Menippe adina. And that's they separated it out as a separate species from the Florida stone crab, which is Menippe mercenaria. This happened in the 1980s. Florida stone crabs are bigger than our stone crabs, and for the longest time they thought maybe ours was just a a smaller version or didn't have the same kind of nutrition, but they found out it's a separate species, which is genetics always provides interesting conclusions for us. So here's a front view of it. This is a male, this is a female, and you can see the different sizes of the claws. This is the pinching claw, this is the crushing claw here. They live on the jetties, they live in oyster reefs, rocky areas. They're often found in marshes. They like to eat hard stuff. You can see by the size of these claws what they're adapted to. So they'll eat some of the mussels that are in the marsh. They can crush through oyster shells. They'll eat polychaetes that are on the oyster shells, any kind of other crustaceans. Sometimes they'll eat dead stuff that might float up into the oyster reef, but most of the time they just leave it alone. They are the longest living of our crabs. They can live up to 8 years. They're sexually mature at 2 years, and these females can reproduce more than once. Well, the blue crabs can too, but they're going to reproduce only over one season. These guys will reproduce over many seasons. The stone crabs will molt only at night, and they have to go into a hiding place, and it's usually a hole somewhere, and then they'll molt in the hole. Blue crabs tend to molt more out in the open than the stone crabs do. What's interesting about stone crabs is that if they feel that they are ready to molt and it's in the daytime and they're out in the open, then they have a gland called an X gland on their eye stalk, which you can hardly see here because they're very recessed, that will kick in, and those hormones will delay molting until the crab can get to someplace safe or at night, which is sort of interesting. And also interesting is that the chelae are proportionally larger each molt. So it's not like as the crab gets bigger, the chelae are getting bigger in proportion with the crab. As the crab molts, the body's getting bigger. Then the older the crab is, the bigger the chelae are. So you can sort of tell if you've got an old crab like this one, or whoops, I'm not going to go all the way back, but you can tell by the size of the claw if you have a really old crab or not. Okay, stone crabs. Marsh crabs. Our representative is a square-back marsh crab, and they're about an inch. So this picture is much bigger than they really are. Their chela are equal in size. This one has been separated from its cheleped. But the chela of males, this is a male, are bigger than the chela of the females, but they don't have any dimorphism in their chela. These are semi-terrestrial. So if you see a little tiny crab that's way up high in the marsh, way away from the water, or climbing up and down pilings on docks, or up on the top of the rocks in the jetties, and they're little tiny, those are probably squareback marsh crabs. They consume only vegetation. So it'll be like algae on the rocks or algae on the deck pilings. And in the marsh, they eat the outermost leaves of some of the Spartina plants and other plants. In Cape Cod, they have been responsible for actually destroying some Spartina marshes there, but I don't think we have any fear of that in the Gulf Coast. I think in Cape Cod, they don't have much to eat, so that's what they are eating on. Another very small crab in Galveston Bay is a mud crab, and our most common one is estuarine mud crab, Rhythropanopius harrisi. They're called mud crabs, but they prefer habitats other than mud. Most of where we see them are going to be in oyster reefs or around wood again, but they're different from the squareback marsh crab in their shape. This one really is square. This one is a little more rounded, and it tapers a little more toward the abdomen. They're native in Galveston Bay, the Texas Gulf, and the eastern US coast, but they are invasive all over the world. These little tiny 1-inch crabs, less than 1-inch crabs, are invasive in California. They're a real problem in California. They've been they're trying to get rid of them in Europe. They're on an extermination um, path there, but they do fine here, and they're not a problem here. Then we have fiddler crabs, and this is what we, if you've been on bay walks, you're really familiar with fiddler crabs in Galveston Bay, and I'm probably going to repeat what you know about them, but if you haven't been part of our bay walks at the state park, this might be some new and interesting information for you. We have 3 species in Galveston Bay, but most of the time we're seeing this one, the mudflat fiddler crab, Uca rapax. And one of the things that all the fiddler crabs are known for is this greatly enlarged chela on the males. The females have 2 small ones. I don't have any females in this page, but the males have 1 greatly enlarged one. The other 2 that you might encounter are the red jointed, and some of them have actual red chela, but others have sort of the yellowish chela, but you can tell they are the red jointed because they have these red spots in their claws. And then Uca spinocarpa has actually longer chela. It's hard to tell in this picture, but they have spines up here. This means spiny wrist. They have spines up here in this part of the chela, not so much difference in the actual end of it. But like I mentioned, Uca rapax is the one you're going to see the most. So they make burrows in the mud, and then they live in them. And except for certain times of the tidal cycle, they'll be hiding down in their burrows. They're in the low and middle mudflat zones. They are truly, they might look terrestrial because they run around on the surface a lot, but they're truly aquatic. They've got to spend a lot of time down in their burrows where they have water. The males have that 1 greatly enlarged chela, and this is used for display, mating displays and territorial displays with other males. And then they have 1 business end chela, which is used for feeding. So if you think about it, here's a female. This is not a Uca rapax. This is a pugulator, but it's the best picture I could find, sorry. But it looks like ours. So it has 2 little chelas, so it can feed itself constantly. This guy can only feed with 1 hand. So if you look at the feeding efficiency, the females are much better at it than the males. The males are spending a lot of their time defending their territories and trying to attract females, and they can't eat as much. So the crabs will dig out burrows as deep as the water line. So in the state park, the water line is pretty close to the surface, the underlying water. So the burrows don't have to be very deep. But if you go up into sort of the higher marsh areas, they have to dig a little deeper burrows to get down to the water. This is one of my colleagues on our bay walks calls this their living room swimming pool, which is pretty much what it is. They have to be down there to keep their gills moist. They don't feed down here. They feed on the surface. They come out during low tide and feed. They usually come right after the tide has washed out or has retreated, so they can get detritus and algae and other little things off the surface. And then the rest of the day, they're down in their burrows. Here's one coming out of its burrow. They use their burrows for resting, hibernating, and mating. So the males will try to attract a female at the surface. If he's successful, she will enter his burrow. They will go in the burrow and they will mate. And then she'll go back to her own burrow. After the mating, females, after mating occurs, the females will migrate to the edge of the water at a low tide. I'm sorry, at a high tide, and release the eggs. And then as the tide goes out, it takes the eggs out into the bay. The little crabs remain as larvae until they molt into juveniles, and then they'll make their way back up on shore again. These are a little different from the other crabs in that they don't actually molt. They resorb their carapace, and as they resorb their carapace, that means basically dissolve it and take it into their body, and then they build a new carapace from that. So it's they're not actually, their carapace isn't growing, but they don't have to leave a carapace to get a new one. They feed on the surface by scraping particles through their mouth parts, as sort of in the same manner that you saw in the video earlier. And then they sift out whatever is digestible, and they roll up it with some of their salt water in their mouth and expel the indigestible material. So these large sand balls that we see on the mud flat are from rolling sand out of their burrows. So when the tide comes up and it fills up the burrow with water, then it's going to bring in sand as well. So these fiddler crabs have to maintain their burrows constantly. So when the tide goes out, then they're rolling sand out of their burrows. And so the large balls of sand are the excavated sand. And then all these little small pellets that you see around here are the little balls that have been sifted for food. So this is just little sand mud balls in there. And you can see the scrapes in, if you get out there at the right time, and people haven't walked out there, or it hasn't rained, or the water hasn't come back up over the burrows, you can see the scrapes that the little fiddler crabs have made in their feeding activities. Pretty cool. So this is I took this video down at the park. This is a social feeding. So all of these, at this point, all of these fiddler crabs are far away from their burrows. If they get disturbed, they head back to some burrow, but they're feeding. This is you can see a lot of the balls, little balls that they've expelled, but you can also see how they're feeding. The males are picking up food with just one chela. Here's a female here who can eat doubly as fast. So very interesting little way. If you stand there very quietly, they don't see you. They don't. But if you take a step, they all disappear. Our last group are the hermit crabs. And they're in Galveston Bay. We have 3 different species representing 2 different families. We have the left-handed hermit crabs, which are sometimes they're called striped hermit crabs. Texas Parks and Wildlife says their official name is thin-striped hermit, Clibanerius vittatus, which is this guy. And you can see why he's called the thin stripe or the stripe, because these walking legs all have stripes on them. And this is the most common one that we see in Galveston Bay. And then the other 2 are right-handed. And this is they are in the family Paguridae. This is the flat claw hermit, and this is the long-wristed hermit. Now, they're not left-handed or right-handed like we talk about snails or gastropods. These are just sort of, they're in quotes here because these are just anecdotes, I guess you can say, about which claw is bigger. So in the Paguridae, the right claw is usually bigger. That doesn't mean the left claw can't be bigger, but the right claw is usually bigger. And in the thin-striped hermits, the left claw is probably bigger. Now, every thin-striped hermit I've ever seen, I couldn't tell the difference between the claw size, but somebody who knows said that the left claw is probably bigger. Don't use this as a way to identify them, though, because they can vary. But you can see there's a lot of difference in the way these guys look, so you can tell one from the other. Another interesting thing, if you look at the shells that these are residing in, these pagurids are normally in moon snail shells. They usually do not. This is a just went out of my head. Hemistoma, the oyster drill shell. The thin stripes are usually in them. The pagurids are usually in the snail shells. And again, that's not a way to identify them. It's just sort of an anecdote there. When these are small, you often find them in the Littorina shells in the marsh. So they are adapted to occupy empty mollusks shells that they scavenge, and they absolutely have to have them because their abdomen has no carapace on it at all. It's completely exposed. So what they have to do is find a snail shell that is the right size for them, and then get into it and anchor themselves inside. When they are preyed on, their predators can yank them out of the shell, and then this is very, very tasty to them. Their larvae are free swimming, and during their molting, they're going to metamorphose into these benthic shell-seeking juveniles. And you can see this really does not resemble the true crabs that we've just talked about. Their whole body plan is different. Their whole ecology is associated with competing for shells to occupy. They will fight with each other. They will kill each other if necessary to get a shell, because they have to have the right shell. If they don't have the right shell, they won't survive. And here you can see these two chela look exactly the same size to me. So here's your test. What kind of crab are these? And I'm going to invite you to unmute and just call out what you think this one is. Number one.
Blue crab.
Blue crab. Number two.
Not a blue crab.
Fiddler.
Fiddler, right. Number three.
Blue crab.
No, not a blue crab. It's blue, but look how small this is a chela. These are some things that you could find on the beach or in the mud flat. So this is the reason I'm showing you this is so you might be able to identify some of these crabs if you just see their chela laying on the mud or the beach.
A hermit crab.
This is from a hermit crab. How about this one?
That looks like a hermit crab too.
It's not though. This is from the square-backed marsh crab. These are not scaled to size. Maybe that's not fair. This is an easy one. Hermit. I'm sorry, Fiddler. This should be an easy one.
Is it a fiddler crab?
No.
This one's Fiddler. What's this one?
Stone crab.
Stone
Stone
crab.
crab.
That's a good crushing picture. And what about this one?
Ugly.
That was
Spiny.
this guy right here.
There he is.
Black claw hermit.
Yeah, that's the other hermit crab.
Yeah. Okay, so you can identify some crab claws that you saw on the beach. Now, that's not all the crabs we get. Remember, these crabs are very salinity dependent, and in Galveston Bay varies in salinity. The 6 I showed you, you can always find in Galveston Bay. But when the salinity gets high, sometimes some of these other marine crabs will find their way into the bay. And all of these crabs have been found in the bay before. This is another swimming crab. This is a calico crab. It looks a lot like a blue crab, except it's spotted. This is a purse crab. My students found one of these last fall in Christmas Bay. Spider crabs every once in a while make their way up into Galveston Bay. Box crabs and porcelain crabs. So all of these are Gulf crabs that have been found in the bay, but they're not residents of the bay because they need high salinity. And then every once in a while, if we have a storm or something causes a lot of wave action that might bring other crabs into the bay. This is the one you guys are probably familiar with out on the beach. This is the ghost crab. You'll never find it in the bay because it likes sand dunes unless we've had a hurricane or some other kind of wild weather on the beach side that may toss these guys into the bay. And if sargassum makes it into the bay, which is highly unusual, then every once in a while you might be able to find a sargassum crab. And sargassum crabs, if you look at the shape here, they are swimming crabs. They're in that same family, Fortunidae. So I'm going a little bit over, but this is my last slide. Why are crabs important? Ecologically, they're very important because they are detritivores. There's some papers out there that say if it wasn't for the crabs in coral reefs, the coral reefs would not be able to survive because of the detritivore contribution that crabs make. Crabs are food for other species, including humans. And if you look at crabs like our fiddler crabs, they are habitat engineers. They dig these big holes and they allow oxygen to circulate into the habitat, into the mud flats that will help other species survive. In Galveston Bay, unfortunately, blue crabs are declining. Nobody's really even paying attention to the other species of crabs. So we don't know, as far as populations go, how they're doing. But since the 1980s, blue crabs have been declining. And so that's of concern. So if we try to figure out why, it might be that they're being overfished by people. It might be that they're being overpreyed on by some of these other fish. Whoops. I'm sorry, recreational fishermen are on these fish. Then we have the crabbers that may be overfishing the blue crabs. But I think the most people believe at this point, Texas Parks and Wildlife believe that is the decline in freshwater inflow that has the most serious impact on the blue crab because there's not as much food out there for these crabs. So we can't eliminate overfishing, and I've heard stories, I think these are true, that most of Maryland crabs come from Texas or come from the Gulf. So they could be overfished. But anyway, that's it. A little bit over time. I'm sorry, but don't worry, be crabby.
Wow, Cindy, I learned so much that I didn't know about crabs. It's not even funny. You gave us so much information in an hour, and we've got questions.
Great.
So I actually have a little question myself. When you're talking about the blue crabs, the zoya and the megalops, what eats those tiny, tiny little creatures?
What eats them?
Yes.
Oh, they're part of the zooplankton fish. Anything bigger than they are going to eat them. The megalops will eat the zoya. I mean, in the zooplankton world, size matters because if you're little, you're going to be eaten by anything that's bigger than you. And so the idea is you try to grow as fast as you can. So you're the eater and not the prey.
And not the ED. Okay. Yeah. All right.
The reason those little zoya have that spine on them is that protects them a little bit from being preyed on because it's sharp, but they still get preyed on a lot.
Right. Thank you for that. So for the questions, I think Walter's got a question and a comment. We'll start with you. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Well, we've had several summers where we've seen large groups, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of female blue crabs come ashore in the Gulf side and found them on the jetties. Not every year, but it has usually been in early July. And we've lived here, 30 years or 40 years? So some of those summers that's happened. Is that a phenomena that you've appreciated or it's common?
What they're doing is they're coming back in after they've gone to the high salinity water to drop their eggs. And so they all are sort of mate at that time of year. And then, their instinct says they need to go to high salinity water. So they're all going there. And then they come back. They don't all come back. Some of them are staying out there, but mostly those are going to be females that are dropping eggs.
Females, yes.
Yeah, yeah. They're all shedding their eggs.
Interesting.
Those are good years for crabs.
Yes, that's true.
Then I had a question too. This is Olivia. I wondered what the carapace of the blue crab's chemical composition is. And because you don't see a lot of those molted carapaces, I wondered if they have any nutritional value for other organisms and they're being consumed, or if they're just deteriorating in the water.
So they're composed of chitin, which is a protein. And I think both of those hypotheses are correct. They can be eaten. Some crabs will eat their own carapace. Blue crabs don't, but some crabs will. So they must be getting some nutrition out of that. And I imagine other detritivores are also eating them. They're also pretty fragile, and just wave action and disturbance in the water can break them up. But yeah, if you find one, it's really special.
Okay, I think next is Patty. You've got a question?
Yes, Cindy, this was extremely interesting. I learned so much about crabs that I never even thought to think about. But my question is, how do they harvest the soft shell crabs for restaurants, or are they commercially raised? And the second part is it just blue crabs that are soft shell crabs?
The first part of your question, I believe that all of the soft-shell blue crabs, or I shouldn't say all, most of the soft-shell blue crabs are going to be commercially raised, because otherwise they'd just be searching all over. I think if a crabber finds a soft shell, it's a treat for them, but they're commercially raised. What was the second question?
Are they all blue crabs that are?
Oh, so blue crabs are, I mean, we eat other crabs, but with stone crabs, I believe the regulations are you can only harvest the claws. You can't harvest the whole animal. And in Florida, you can harvest both claws, which I think is cruel because then the poor crab can't eat. But in other places, you can only harvest the crushing claw, I think, and then you have to let the crab go. The nice thing about stone crabs is they can regenerate their claws without molting. A blue crab has to molt to regenerate its claws. So we don't boil stone crabs in mostly. I'm not going to say nobody does it, but it's not really done commercially. The only ones that we boil whole are the blue crabs.
Okay, thank you.
This is Fran. I just wanted to add, I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, and in good crab years, you could catch crabs that were larger females with smaller males on their backs, like guarding them. Yep. And then you could take these pairs of crabs and put them in the water in a crab pot and wait until the soft shells actually emerged.
And that's the ecology. If you understand the ecology, you can beat it. The males, they know when a female they can sense it through pheromones. They know when a female is getting ready to molt, and they'll go guard her. You're right.
All right, I guess our next question is Terry Duncan. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, mentioned that I believe it was the mud crabs are not invasive here. We have them, but they're invasive in Europe and California. What do we have that are they? Do we have predators here, or are they more? Do they have? What makes them so prevalent in the other areas and become invasive?
Well, that's the question about invasive species anywhere. In their native habitats, species do not become invasive because there are ecological checks on them. It could be the salinity, it could be predators, it could be food. And for these invasive species, when you introduce them to a place where they've never been before, they don't have predators. They don't have competitors, and the world is just open to them. And apparently that's what's happened with these little mud crabs.
Fascinating.
Okay, I think, oh, go ahead.
Oh, that's all. I know that's true about invasiveness, but I didn't know if they had studied and found out why. what the actual reason was in those other places.
I would say it's probably they don't have predators. That's probably the most important one. They don't have
Okay.
the predators that we have here.
Thanks.
I think that's our last question,
Great.
unless someone else has one. And I'm turning it over now to Varva.
Cindy, every time I listen to you, I go away with so much information in my head. I know you told me this is the first time you've given a presentation on crabs, and I cannot believe it because the wealth of information here has been incredible. And you can tell from all the questions that I'm not alone with that, because people have really been engaged and listening. And we had about 56 people joining us, and that didn't count couples, so more than that. And thank you. It was truly wonderful. And I appreciate your doing this.
Thank you, everybody.
If you don't have anything else to say, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen for just a minute to do the final wrap up.